Good day to everybody. We're here today to listen to Rafiq Jumabhoy, who is from Orkney Holdings, which is a international advisory firm focused on strategy and project implementation in real estate and related service areas. He's been involved in the corporate and national business world for many decades, from Singapore, but working globally in Europe and Asia. And we're here as part of the post-COVID or the current COVID-19 series, looking at what's happening in the world, how the world is changing, and we're really delighted to talk about what's happening in the business community. Rafiq, thanks very much for joining us.
Bridget, thank you for a very nice welcome. Thank you.
So let's start. What do you see is happening with COVID-19 in the business community? What's going on?
Okay. Well, I think before we just jump into that, perhaps I ought to just preface my comments by saying where I think we are in the crisis resolution world. From my experience, crises go through about 6 phases. First, you get the intuition that there's a problem, the warning, and then you get the response, and then you assess the risk. Then you decide how you're going to react, and then you manage it, and then you see the results, and hopefully you have resolution. So you go through a number of phases. I think at the moment, we are still between the risk evaluation and the response phase. And that's why I think we're seeing a lot of very different sorts of responses, going back and saying, hey, that was the wrong one, and then moving forward. That's one side of it. I think the other side of it is that different governments are reacting differently to the crisis. And therefore, businesses which have an international footprint have a very different focus from ones that are just based purely locally. But the confusion is no less in other countries than in Malaysia.
Well, yes, maybe in some places much worse, right, in that situation, definitely. So tell me, where do you think we're at right now? So you've talked about in the stages, what do you think is coming next?
Well, I think we are still grappling with the response, but from a business point of view, those of us who are actually on the ground in business can't really afford to wait until governments try to sort themselves out. And I think you're seeing a number of different responses. I was actually very interested to see, for example, that Daikin, which is an air conditioning manufacturer, it's gone really what I call a full panic. I mean, it's like looking at a dystopian movie in terms of how they're actually managing the crisis. But they're really going all the way. Versus maybe companies like Brown in Penang, which are taking it very seriously, but not to the extremes that someone like Daikin is doing. So I think different companies are in different response in terms of manufacturing. Now,
when you speak about panicking, what do you mean by Daikin exactly? What are they doing that's making them panic?
Well, no, I wouldn't say they're not panicking, but I'm saying that they've responded as if they have to do everything possible.
Okay.
What
clear.
Singapore
Thanks.
would call the kiasu approach.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead. You were saying.
So I think that in business, what we're really at is for individual industries, where am I at? What am I having to do? And I think one of the things that this crisis has created is that it has created people to have to go back to thinking very strategically about where they are as a business, right? And a lot of people are questioning that.
What do you see? I mean, if you think about the kind of COVID-19, is this sort of a crisis fundamentally different than other crises?
Yes, I think it is. I think there has been a precedent. In fact, there are 2 that I would like to quote. One, of course, is the 1930s depression, because that was really a worldwide phenomenon. The second, actually, I'd like to just suggest we look at is what happened after 9/11. Now, in 1928, we had, and during the 9/11, we had the leadership of America and we had a fairly coordinated response. Not so coordinated in the 30s, but certainly very coordinated after 9/11. And you can see that it changed the way in which we travel. It changed the way in which we look at security within buildings. In many ways, it's turned us into a terrorist concerned economy. Now, if I look at today, again, we have a worldwide phenomenon, but this time we don't have American leadership. And so consequently, we're going to see very patchy responses to that. Now, as a business, we're going to have to be, we can't take the lead that in the past you could have taken from a government sitting in the US or in Europe, because we don't have a world coordinated effort. So as a business today, I'm having to think, if I'm a businessman, very locally, how do I respond here? But at the same time, how relevant is my business model to the new market that we're having? And what do I mean by the new market? I mean here that we have got different demand patterns that have arisen as a consequence of this crisis. We have a different resource scenario as a result of this. We're seeing governments saying, look, let me bring back industries back into my own country. And so if you're an export-driven business, how do you have to review that? So I think that this is where this crisis is different.
It's interesting you talk about the different sort of engines of growth that are going to emerge from that, and the kind of national ownership, and that comes with certain sets of priorities. Do you think that there are other features of a kind of transformative features that are taking place in this kind of post-COVID environment? You know, looking back, what will we see as this kind of triggered change besides these kind of shifts in terms of engine priorities in terms of the economy?
Well, I think one of the first things, which I'm sort of not speaking about anything that everybody doesn't know, but it has certainly focused attention on digital means of communication. And so we're going to see a huge uplift in internet and in video conferencing, we've already seen, but that's going to have huge consequences in terms of the way in which telecom industries are structured. You know, right now, much of telecom's industry has been creating bandwidth really for downloading. Mm-hmm. With video conferencing, everybody is becoming an uploader. So we're going to end up with a huge gap in terms of telecommunication capability. So that's one thing that's changing. The other thing I think that's changing is that we're starting to discover that we can get a lot more done actually sitting at a desk than having to commute. So a lot of people are actually saving an hour, hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours a day in moving up and down, which can be more valuably used in terms of communication. Third, I think that what we are seeing is changing demand pattern for energy. And that has got pluses and minuses. Countries that are highly energy exporting, like we are in Malaysia, like in Russia, like in the Middle East, are going to find that their competitive advantage has been greatly curtailed. So I think that is another consequence. And so what is that going to do to the economies of these countries? The next area I think that we need to look at, which is going to be different, is supply chains. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing, and certainly from talking to friends and colleagues around the globe, is that once there will be some migration of manufacturing back to home countries like the US or back into Europe or elsewhere, the big problem is this. And mainly it's because people are saying, well, we can't be so China dependent. The issue here is this, that what China has done over the last 30 to 40 years is created what we have in Silicon Valley, but on the manufacturing world. So you've got huge ecosystems that are highly flexible, that are able to supply at a moment's notice, and a huge concentration of intellectual capital. That is not going to be replicable. And therefore, I do not see, I know this is a bit contrarian, so I do not really see that China is going to lose out hugely. Yes, it will lose out to some extent, but because there is so much concentration of intellectual capital, I think that's one factor. I think the second factor is that as we move away from the automotive world into an electrically driven world, China is again ahead of the game. Then if we look at 5G technology and the use of AI in 5G, again, I think you see a huge concentration of intellectual capital in China. Then if you look at the structure of these businesses, these various different businesses in the rest of the world, I don't know how many countries are able to actually have a directional approach and say, okay, this is where we have a problem. We're going to create the ecosystem here. I don't see that directional capability. So I see that the supply chain issue will change, but I do not see a huge shift out of China. However, countries like Malaysia, which are on crossroads, countries like Vietnam and the Philippines are going to somewhat benefit from the regionalization of the Chinese ecosystem. So that's kind of like a worldview, if you like. Perhaps I'm speaking a bit
Very interesting. You speak a little bit about some of the shifts that are taking place in the kind of manufacturing and how it's going to, these convergence of forces between nationalism and kind of shifts that are happening in terms of technology. What do you see happening in other sectors that you're familiar with, say travel and retail? How do you see those transformative shifts?
Okay, I'd like to sort of look at the two industries that I've done a lot of work in over the years. Not that I've been a travel person, but the effects of travel are very, have a huge impact on real estate, particularly in hospitality, conference facilities, and to an extent even health, as we get more health tourism. So let's look at the travel industry as a kind of like as a core to the rest of what we do in terms of real estate. Quite apart from the sort of local demands. We'll look at local demands in a minute. But if we look at travel, and if I classify travel into three different categories: leisure travel, business travel, and another huge area, which is conference travel. I do see that leisure travel will be much less affected, in fact, might even have a greater influence on travel patterns, despite what's happened with cruise ships. But I see a huge impact on business travel and a huge impact on conference travel, i.e. big declines. This is going to then have an impact on hotels. I mean, right now you're looking, at certain, in Canada, for example, hotels are down below 30% occupancy. It's a little bit better in places like Taiwan, which have not been totally locked down, but it's not great. And in some cases, it's down to zero. When these hotels reopen, are they going to get back the kind of travelers that they had before? I doubt it. So I think we're going to have a lot of excess space. Then, if we switch now to retail, well, hotels, service departments, and I think that a lot of the businesses have become so big in hotels and service departments that I don't see that the incumbents are going to be that ready to make the shift. This has been a huge shock, and many of them will take a bit of time in order to understand what to do. So I see bankruptcies ahead, and I see dislocations in that industry. And of course, then it follows on that the people involved in the industry, et cetera, will be affected. So that's one side of it. And that, I think, also impacts on the restaurant business. Restaurants, at least because they happen to be small scale, will come back with different responses. And I think there is a very interesting case study in Hong Kong of a restaurant chain called, I think it's called Blackstone. I can't quite remember the exact name of the chain, but Blackstone, I think it is Blackstone, and how they've gone about bringing traffic back into their restaurants, but social distancing. They have a bag for a mask on every table. They check the temperature of every guest that comes in. It's a different ball game. So are we going back again, is what I said about, the 9/11 impact, are we going to have to live with that? Or is it that people are going to say at the end of it, listen, this is just too much, this is ridiculous, I'm not going to live with this, I'm just going to carry on with my normal life. I think that's another area. So then if we move away from hospitality businesses and we start looking at retail, I think the impact of the internet on retail, of course, has happened. I mean, I was actually quite interestedly thinking about, before we spoke today, I kind of looked back on a speech that I gave in 2002 in Dubai, talking about how the internet was actually going to become extremely important and that shopping malls really need to rethink their models in the world going forward. Now, if you come forward to today, almost 18 years later, 17 years later, that impact is going to be hugely accelerated by what's happened with the virus. And therefore, I think that the experiences on internet for retail are going to have to improve. So I see very interesting opportunities for, I've always believed that, ultimately retail shopping malls will become showrooms for the delivery of service that might not actually happen in the showroom itself.
Interesting.
Right.
So we're going to see kind of different shifts in terms of how people are buying their products. And that's already changing, but I think the use of space is going to shift. And one really asks the question, where is that extra space going to go? Is it go to housing? Is it going to go into something else?
Right.
New, especially. So, Malaysia is a place that has a lot of office space and a lot of shopping malls.
Yes.
What do you see as kind of some of the trajectories for Malaysian business, kind of short, longer term in the COVID environment?
Well, I think a lot, and unfortunately, I think there's been what I think was said in America some years ago, an over-exuberance of real estate. I think when we did some work for a major bank in Malaysia 2.5 years ago, we actually did a subsector analysis of 256 subsectors of the Malaysian property market. And out of those 256 subsectors, we could only find about 12 that we could recommend that the bank continue lending to. So I do see a huge oversupply. In fact, right now, we are working with a developer on coming up with a completely new concept in terms of how to reutilize a mall. I mean, I faced a similar situation in the 1986-87 crisis in Singapore, when we had like a 30% oversupply of shopping space. And that's when, we came up with the concept of creating food courts in order to change the demand pattern within the mall. We came up with the concept of lifestyle shopping. And ultimately, when the oversupply hit the hotel market, that's when we came up with the concept of service apartments as a different asset class. So I think that the developers and owners of property in Malaysia will have to start thinking more professionally. I think up till now, Malaysian developers have been very ego-driven in terms of how they look at their real estate. I think with this crisis, what a lot of them are going to have to do is to say, hey, hold on a minute. Maybe I think I need some expertise as opposed to thinking I know everything. And talk to people who've already faced this before.
And it's difficult because, you know, land development and use of property is also tied into the political apparatus as well. You know, this is a source of where people make their revenue. So I think these two things are really going to challenge the political model and of where rents are going to come from, as well as the economic model as things move forward. So you've got a warning in terms of transformation in the retail sector. What are the other sort of steps do you see kind of looking, you know, stepping back? Where does Malaysia stand in terms of a business environment? How well is it positioned in the global market?
Okay, I think this is actually very pertinent to Malaysia right now, because just about every single pillar of the economy has been shaken by this virus. Malaysia has been highly oil dependent in terms of its revenues and in terms of exports. That's been very badly hit. Secondly, it's always been a low-cost producer, or large sectors of the manufacturing sector have been low-cost producers. Mm-hmm. Right? And I will come to where it is not in a minute. And then you've got the plantation scene, which has been another extractive element, which with reduced demand, a lot of that is going to be reviewed. Right? So, what are some of the difficulties that Malaysia faces right now? I think one of the major problems is human resource. We have a lot of young people who've been undereducated or miseducated. And because, so that's one area. But coming back to a positive area, if we look at what's happened in Penang and with electronics and with, you know, health-based manufacturing, like injectables, et cetera, actually we have a very strong ecosystem in the Penang subsector. Likewise, in the Klang Valley, we do have ecosystems. So the question is going to be, are we going to improve those ecosystems? Or are we just going to take a sort of a bumbling approach? And I think with a coalition government, if it is unable to actually sit down and say, okay, let's put all our differences aside and let's look at the country first, we won't be able to actually gain the benefits of these ecosystems that we actually have in manufacturing, in electronics. The other thing I think which is very, very positive for Malaysia is that we have a highly creative population. The question is going to be, how do we harness that creativity? How do we direct it? How do we fund it? And how do we let, you know, the young people be able to participate in that ecosystem? So we have huge challenges, but I would say to you that, again, if I go back to my own experience when I was sitting on the Economic Planning Committee in Singapore, how much effort we made then on understanding scenarios. I'm not sure that I'm seeing the same dedication here in Malaysia. If we don't understand our scenarios, how do we work our way out of this? I have another point of optimism for Malaysia. Malaysia is so strategically located. It stands between the engine of China and the raw materials of Africa and the Middle East. How are we going to utilize that? How are we going to use our midpoint geographical advantage and go back to what the Malacca Sultanate had found was its greatest strength, its location? So I do think Malaysia has a future, but provided we have the leadership to take us there.
Well, an optimistic future. It has a future irrespective, but it definitely has an optimistic future if there is leadership, and that is a big challenge. But that is a subject of another presentation, perhaps in another conversation. Thank you very much, Rafiq, for joining us. We greatly appreciate you taking your time to discuss what's happening in this COVID environment, and we look forward to chatting again. Take care.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.